Hi everyone, welcome to our Scot Women Skills event. This is the first in a series of live panel talks and webinars looking specifically at the employment of women in Scotland. I am Eleanor, I'm the Programmes Coordinator for YWCA Scotland. I will be facilitating this evening. If you have any questions at any point during the panel talk, please use the Q&A function and I'll be on there to collate them and feed them back into the panel. Just so you're aware as well, we are recording this webinar, so it will go live on our YouTube channel shortly after this one finishes. So without any further ado, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Patrizia Kupiec, who is the CEO of YWCA Scotland and your chair for this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Elena, and good afternoon or good evening, and welcome to our first Scot Women Skills panel debate. Before I introduce you to our amazing panelists, I wanted to briefly explain our Scot Women Skills campaign and how it came about. So the idea for it really came from the previous campaign that we ran called Eat Your Words campaign, when we asked young women for pitch submissions, and it was a paid opportunity. However, most pitches have vastly undercharged for the work they will be doing if they were successful, and some have not added any budget at all. So that already kind of made us think. And then obviously with COVID-19 developing into an economic crisis, we all know that young women are disproportionately impacted because they are more likely to work in the most affected sectors. Many young women participate in gig economy or do other types of freelance work, lacking stable and protected income. Young women are also more likely to undervalue their skills and experience, and as a result, undersell themselves to potential employers, which is exactly what happened with our Eat Your Words campaign. Women are also disproportionately affected by the need for more unpaid care, impacting on their ability to do paid work. And sadly, this hardship is forecast to continue, and young women will face multiple challenges, including high unemployment levels and limited access to flexible working arrangements. So we wanted to support young women in Scotland through what is shaping up to be an incredibly volatile job market and wider economic upheaval. We invited partners and young women experts to deliver a series of webinars and interactive panels and digital events on employability and post-COVID-19 world. Focus on practical advice and hopes for the future. These will also foster building new peer-to-peer and mentoring networks through digital means. Today's panel, the first one in the series, is going to focus on the employment gender gap. Globally, it is thought that women engage in caregiving 2.5 times more than men. Women's lost earnings to caring responsibilities are estimated to cost £15 million a day in Scotland. Comparing hourly earnings, women in Scotland are still earning 13% less than men. Women are not progressing to leadership roles as often or as quickly. There is a chronic undervaluation of caregiving and unpaid labor. And despite legal requirements, fair maternity leave is still a taboo topic in many industries. So today we want to ask the question, what can we do to find better balance and create employment environment that is fair to women in the workplace? Our panel of experts will weigh in on the causes, effects, and solutions to the employment gender gap. So now I'm very excited to introduce you to our panelists. So first up, we have Miriam Hussain, who is a Young Women Lead Committee member, investigating the transition from education to employment for young Black, Asian, and minority ethnic women in Scotland. Passionate in creating community, Miriam is an engagement and events coordinator at Edinburgh Napier University. And next up, we have Ellie Hutchinson, who is a freelance feminist, working with organizations and practitioners to make social change happen. She has been a policy officer, founder, CEO, prevention worker, support worker, activist, researcher, and a trustee for third sector organizations over the last 14 years, working on issues relating to domestic abuse, tech abuse, housing, children's services, and youth work. She is a founder member of The Collective, a feminist consultancy group, and previously established the Empower Project and Edinburgh Hollaback. She is currently working on projects relating to gender equality, community responses to COVID-19, self-care, and tech abuse. Then we have Lindsey Millen, who is a policy manager and works with colleagues on Close the Gaps policy work. She develops policy papers, reports, and consultation responses to highlight women's experiences of the labor market. She leads on Close the Gaps work with public sector employers and with trade unions, and on supporting employer compliance with the public sector equality duty. She also leads on Close the Gaps advocacy work on gender equality and education policy. And we have Alys Mumford, who is the Communications and Engagement Manager at Engender, Scotland's feminist policy and advocacy organisation. She leads on publications, digital engagement and press work of the organisation, as well as working with partner organisations to further women's equality. During the pandemic, she's been working to highlight the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on women and calling for the Scottish Government to take on a gendered approach to rebuilding our economy. And last but not least, we have Raveena Sajjan, who is a committee member in this year's Young Women Lead cohort, which is looking into transition from education to employment for young women in Scotland from ethnic minorities. With a BA in English and Women and Gender Studies and an MSc in Social Policy and Planning, Raveena is passionate about the need to adapt an intersectional lens when evaluating women's disadvantage in the labour market. She has a particularly strong interest in the school-to-work transition, having previously worked in local government, where she led a successful Preparing for Work programme for over 3,000 young people in one of London's most diverse boroughs. She has experience in both the public and voluntary sectors, is currently working in health and social care policy, and also sits on the Centre for Public Impact People's panel. So these are all of our amazing panelists. I'm very happy to have all of them with us here today. And moving on to the questions that some of you have submitted when you were registering for this event, and some of the questions that we wanted to explore. So the first question that we have is open to all, so any of the panelists can take that, and it's just to get us started and kick things off. So the first question is, do you think that COVID-19 exacerbated existing inequalities in the labour market? And if so, why? And now, Ellie, Alys, Ellie, I could see both of you and who wants to go first?
Alys, you go first.
Yes, simple answer. It absolutely has. Women were unequal before the pandemic, and everything that's happened since has exacerbated that inequality and deepened it, both in the initial responses. So Patricia talked about care work, so schools close, that caregiving responsibility falls on women, but also, as we're seeing now, as we move in and out of getting out of lockdown, the responses, the things that employers are doing and the things that governments are doing to try and get us out of COVID are having a massive impact on women, and particularly on Black and minority ethnic and other minoritized women, who are more likely to be working in pret-a-manger and being told that workers need to go and buy their sandwiches every day or the world's going to crumble. So yes, absolutely.
Ellie, do you want to?
Yeah, no, that was, exactly. Like ditto. Yeah, for sure. And I think particularly I'm a mum of two smallest children. And definitely what I found was that the caring responsibility aspect, for sure, we sort of found like felt like a lot of things were sort of going back in time a wee bit, of just the expectations of what women were supposed to do at home. In heterosexual two-parent families, it very much was like, the idea was the man would be locked in the study all day and the woman would look after the kids. One, that's incredibly exclusionary anyway to how a lot of families look. But two, it just perpetuates that notion that men have no role in taking care of their kids. So I definitely saw that in just reading the papers, but also in my own circle as well, of what was happening with my friends and their sort of setups at home. And it was really disappointing as well to see a lot of men sort of fall back into those roles that you kind of hoped they would be challenging at this point.
Yeah.
Can I come in on this one?
Yeah, of course.
Close the Gap actually did a piece of research recently which looked at how women have been impacted by the job disruption related to COVID-19, and I would echo what Alys and Ellie have said here. You know, there's so many different ways in which women have been impacted more acutely because of their pre-existing inequality, because men and women tend to do different types of work. The jobs that women tend to do have been found in the front line, and so have been more exposed to the virus, more exposed to the risks associated with it. The jobs that men have tended to do are more likely to be able to be done from home, and also, you know, are better paid, because those jobs that women are tending to do, the frontline jobs that suddenly we're all aware of, I mean, we've obviously been aware of them, but the wider public is aware of jobs that tend to be more invisible, like care work, suddenly being designated as essential when they've been paid so poorly, like poverty wages, minimum wage work to look after, you know, older people and disabled people and children. All of that work has suddenly been more visible and essential, when, you know, historically the jobs that men have tended to do have been seen as the high status jobs that contribute the most to the economy. So that, I think that's been a really important thing that's come out of COVID in terms of the additional visibility that's been added to that. But it doesn't mean that clapping for carers isn't going to pay their, you know, their bills. It doesn't. We're not seeing that follow through into actual meaningful policy change to tackle the issues that have been made more visible. And so it's kind of, you know, similar to the issue where, you know, men have been not stepping up to their responsibilities where they have children and just leaving everything to their partner if they're in an opposite sex couple. All of these things we've heard kind of discussed in the media, like, oh, maybe, you know, this will be great because care workers will be more recognised, and oh, you know, maybe men will step up and they'll do more work at home raising their kids, but it's just not happening. And so, yeah, the situation has exacerbated pre-existing inequalities, and I think, yeah, has a real risk of rolling women back to the 1950s, if not the Dark Ages.
Yeah.
Could I come in on this?
Yeah.
And I think Miriam probably as well. I guess another thing that I would say is that besides the gendered expectations with caring and that coming out with COVID, I think another thing is also just how difficult it will be to access the labour market, particularly for young, less experienced women, and particularly even more so from those of ethnic minority background. There was a news story that actually came out in the BBC today, I'm not sure if anyone else saw it, about basically a number of stories from a number of people who've basically said that they've made like over 100 applications in Scotland and been rejected, not getting an interview. So I think that's also another thing about who wasn't accessing the labour market before and who's even more disadvantaged now because of just how much competition there will be. And actually, I mean, Miriam and I will go through the inquiry and our findings a little bit later, but we actually had an important point raised in our findings where a number of the survey respondents talked about how they were afraid that because organizations are going into survival mode, that diversity and inclusion won't be a priority anymore either. And so in terms of the career development and progression for young BAME women, that might not be a priority. So I think so many different issues coming out from the pandemic that existed before, but even more so, even worse off now in terms of inequality.
And just quickly, just in response to what you're saying there, it's quite interesting of that thing of organisations going into crisis mode. Therefore, what they think is like baggage they can drop is like excess weight, rather than what is intrinsic and inherent to actually the culture of how they do work. And I think that's the worry. Like Lindsey was saying, like we're rolling back so much that if people are seeing this as like a pick and mix, like I can do it if we've got the luxury to do it, then like the progress that maybe we had hoped we were making actually was only ever surface level to some extent. And that's, I think, what's really worrying as well, is like having to sort of, I mean, worrying, but also maybe it's that unearthing, isn't it? It's that revealing of what's really there. So maybe it gives us that visibility to like, right now we know what we've kind of got to do.
I think the point about matching that Lindsey made about matching the visibility with the action, and what you're talking, Raveena, about, you know, organisations, companies feeling they could just drop diversity because they were only doing it for PR or for luxury. You know, often the same places that are putting out Black Lives Matter tweets, talking in solidarity, and then when you dig into it, look at what they're putting money into, look at what they're putting time and staff resources into. It's, as you say, it's ignoring those issues. So yeah, I think we really need to be vigilant and scrutinise, like if words are matching actions in all of these things.
Yeah, and like all of that, you know, the deprioritisation of gender inequality that we've seen in government responses to COVID and employers' responses to COVID, it's not, I mean, I don't think that was like unexpected, because I do think equality is still seen as a nice to have, instead of understanding that inequality is it permeates everything. But it doesn't make any economic sense to be like, oh, we'll just wait until we've got all the important stuff sorted and then we'll deal with the women's issues. Because all you do then is make it harder and more costly for you to address those issues at the other end, because they've got so much worse. So I think it's sort of really revealing what is underneath the lack of action on gender equality, and that it's not just about, you know, it's really difficult, or, you know, we need a culture change. It's about making political choices. What do we value? What are we going to put money into? What are we going to put effort into? Yeah, so it's kind of revealing a lot about societal values and where they're perhaps not where they need to be.
Just to add one more little point, talking about like the impact of BAME communities in sectors where perhaps working from home is less of an option, and may have had to leave work due to risk. And this is, I feel like, is quite relevant in, for example, alone in Scotland, South Asian communities. A lot of South Asian communities are self-employed. Like, for example, just looking at my own parents, my own mother, she runs a shop, and the actual impact of doing so during COVID when the supermarkets were closed, and it's not just physical impact and inequality of having to work on the front line if there's no choice of that. It is emotional impact on top of that, which they were already feeling already. And just using my own mother as an example, running the shop, she's already had to apply 2 times for a self-employment grant for, we thought people were saying to her that this is actually a great time for shopkeepers, you know, to be out there and open, and you get all the customers that you weren't not going to the big supermarkets anymore. But actually, my mother and my father in this instance were both vulnerable, are at the age where they were seen as vulnerable for COVID, but they kept going because of the pressures of doing so for their community and for people that were coming outside of the community to look for essentials and, well, in a lot of cases, non-essential. So I think self-employment, where they really have a little choice but to crack on or find different ways, there's a lot of inequalities have been exposed that way as well.
Yeah, that's such a good point. So it's like that balance of like having opportunity, because those things are being exposed, and we now have opportunity to highlight those things and make sure that those things are being prioritized, and really, as all of you mentioned, kind of scrutinize the organizations that are only putting out those like calls for action on a surface level, and then they are not investing any money or time or effort into creating actual change, but at the same time juggling all of these things and all of these inequalities and all of these intersections of inequality that we are all experiencing and our communities are experiencing. So it's that sort of balance of like, we now have an opportunity because everyone can see those cracks, like they're so visible that like it's that real time of like galvanized movements for change, because everyone can see what's happening, but at the same time it's so easy to like swipe it under the rug and just continue, or even like roll back, as some of you mentioned. So on that note, I was wondering if I can bring Alys and Lindsey to talk us through 9 principles for economic recovery.
Sure, Lindsey, do you want to kick off? You're muted currently.
Every time I use Zoom, I realise for the 100th time that pressing the spacebar on my computer doesn't work to unmute me. So there you go. There's a lesson. Alys, do you want to go first on this, and then I'll talk about the more employment-y stuff?
Sure. So Engender and Close the Gap, along with other organisations, including the Young Women's Movement, produced and released 9 principles for an economic recovery that actually works for women. And this was after the sort of initial shock of COVID, when everyone had scrambled around to try and figure out what was going on. and deal with the personal crises that everyone was dealing with, and trying to highlight the disproportionate impact on women, was when government started talking about what comes next, and how do we get out of this. And it came from that knowledge that Lindsey touched on, that although the work of all of our organisations and all feminists is to constantly try and get progress, actually a lot of the work is stopping things rolling back, and rights being taken away. And we know that the equality before COVID wasn't working for women. We know that the majority of unpaid care was still being done by women. We knew that women were getting paid less, their work was valued less. So while obviously not wanting to look at the pandemic in any sort of a positive light, it is, as Patricia talked about, that opportunity to say, right, we've seen the cracks. How can we try and build back better, to steal a phrase from another movement. But so we produced these principles, which was basically guidelines for the government, saying, look, we know you're thinking about these things, decisions are being taken incredibly quickly, don't muck it up. And the furlough scheme, I think, was a really good example of that. So when they introduced the scheme where if you were out of work you could be on furlough, that didn't include care as one of the reasons you might not be able to be working every day when your kids were suddenly home from school and the care homes were, not doing day trips, all these sorts of things. So we know that women will be ignored if we're not there shouting, can you remember half the population, please? So these 9 principles cover things around how we have that economic recovery. So what do we need to recover from? What does that recovery need to look like? And why are we trying to recover? And it's not just, it's to make our lives better, make everyone's lives better. And we know that equality does that. But we also know that the economy, whatever that means, the whole nebulous thing of it, is bad for women currently, both the sort of formal economy in work and the informal equality and some of the issues of childcare. So we've produced these principles to say, actually, when we're talking about investing as a nation, let's not talk about what motorways we're building, let's talk about what childcare facilities we're building, let's talk about who we're employing in these projects, let's look at what we mean by economic success. Is it about how many millionaires we have in a country, or is it about how many people we have living in poverty, and how happy everyone is, and how healthy people are. So we pulled together these principles to try and constantly remind the government to be thinking about women. And Lindsey, I think, is going to talk about some of them in a bit more detail around the employment issues.
Yeah, I mean, the 9 principles they build on the kind of shoulders of the work of feminist economists, and trying to bring visibility to women in the economy, because as Alys said, what is the economy? It's an imaginary thing, rational economic man, all that nonsense that has been completely disproven. We wanted to create the principles because we know that generic references to equality, like we will consider equality in everything we do, which I think I've seen written more times than any other phrase in policies, in employer policies, than anything else. It doesn't mean anything, it doesn't achieve anything. We don't need more warm words. We need specific commitments. We need gender equality to be core to decision making and policy making. Because as we said at the start, it's not just a nice to have, it runs through everything. Women have different experiences of almost everything. And it's just fundamentally an injustice that policy continues to fail women's needs, continues to leave them further behind. And so thinking about investment, as Alys said, is really important. There's a lot of talk of jobs. But what does that mean? Jobs for who? The current chat around the work that will be going into, protecting jobs and retraining people and providing access to jobs is focused on stereotypically male sectors. It's sectors where men tend to be employed, where there are continued barriers to women accessing jobs in those sectors because of really toxic workplace cultures and long hours cultures, and just it's not an easy place for a woman to be in. And that all starts right back before the young girls even enter education, with gender stereotypes and how that feeds all the way through the education pipeline. So if we allow that narrative to dominate talk about investment, the money that goes into this economic recovery is really going towards men's economic recovery. And there's a lot of talk about infrastructure, and the drum that we have been banging forever is care is infrastructure. Childcare, social care, it's infrastructure. It enables people to get to work, primarily enables women to get to work in the same way as roads do, the same way as digital infrastructure does. So what we know is that things that are designated as critical infrastructure get more money. So we are asking for care to be designated as critical infrastructure in order to try and get more money put into care. A couple of the principles that relate to work specifically talk to the unpaid work that women do and the work in which women tend to be concentrated. And the kind of key thread pulling those two things together is like care work and work that tends to be done in the home, either done in the home in a private setting, unpaid, or in a private setting as an employee, whether you're a domestic worker, a cleaner, or a person who provides care in the home. These jobs have historically been done by women. They have historically been invisible, continue to be invisible, and because they're done in a private setting, they are seen as unskilled. You don't need to have any skills to be able to do them, and so we don't need to pay people who do those jobs very much at all. And again, that kind of chimes with the whole narrative around key workers that we're hearing, you know, and suddenly these workers are essential. Suddenly these workers are the ones that everyone sees, that the entire economy rests on. So we need an economy that values unpaid work, that makes policy accommodations that enables that unpaid work to be done without having an economic detriment to the vast majority of people who are women who are doing it. And also we need that work to be paid better in the labour market. And in terms of what government can do about that, public investment is a massive part of, you know, women's work being paid more, particularly social care as an example. If government used its wage setting powers, if local authorities used their wage setting powers to raise wages in that sector, that would go a long way to, you know, valuing that work. So yeah, those are the 9 principles, not specifically, but the kind of the ethos of them and the purpose of them.
That's great. Thank you so much. And I saw that Alys also put the 9 principles in the chat box. So if anyone wants to have a look at them, just copy that for after the panel if you want to scrutinize any of them. But yeah, they're a very good kind of rebuilding blocks for what better and fairer future in Scotland could look like after this current crisis that we are in. So I would encourage everyone to have a look at them. And that's kind of, yeah, we touched a lot upon unpaid work and care. So that takes me really nicely to the next question for Ellie, which is what can be done to improve work experiences for mothers and carers and ensure adequate support and equal opportunities in the workplace?
So when I was thinking about answering this question, my notes are kind of getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So I've managed to drill it down to essentially 3 headings of you've got a kind of material, cultural and systemic aspects. And actually what Alys and Lindsey were just saying there is totally ties in with what I was kind of thinking around, you know, the economy is bad for women. And I think that's the first starting point. So anything that we're talking about in terms of like material changes that need to happen, so like money that needs to change for women. So quite often we talk about like more encouraging workplaces for women, we're talking about flexible working or we're talking about job shares, but it doesn't take into account that a lot of women are working part-time anyway, and that they're often working in like multiple jobs or they're working in shift work. So that doesn't take into account all women, it takes into account just a certain segment of women. There's also a thing of like, if you're in a opposite sex relationship, because of patriarchy, the man is going to be paid more than you. So it makes sense sometimes for women to make that decision that for the family, they will work part-time. So you've got this whole structure that are going around that, an economic system that's like, I always feel it, you kind of, women are having to contort them, mothers are having to contort themselves into quite uncomfortable shapes to fit a patriarchal system of work. And I find, and that's one of the reasons that I went freelance, to be honest, because I was kind of fed up of bending and twisting myself into different roles that didn't fit the needs of me or my family. And so I think, yeah, we've got this kind of material aspect, but then I think there's also like a cultural thing within workplaces. And I think having managers or staff who are also parents really helps, because then they understand there's like an emotional labor that goes on, but you have done half a day's work by the time you get to work often as a parent, and then you're going to do another day's work by the time you get home. So sometimes when people talk about flexible working, I've heard these like horror stories that are wrapped up in like good news stories of like women saying, I can work flexibly, so I get to take my children to school, and then after I get to pick them up at 3, and then after they go to bed, I carry on working until midnight. That is not a good news. That is not great. Like, that is just like a shortcut to burnout, but we've kind of bought into this, like, that's the best we're going to get. So that's great. So there's some of that bit as well of like recognizing that actually like caring for other people isn't just like a part of your personality that you park and then you get to work and you're a worker. It's you're a whole person bringing all of that experience to the workplace. And I think some of that comes down to the fact that we don't value childcare and we don't value caring in our society at all. So that we're not seeing them as transferable, valuable skills. We're not seeing it as the fact that like, and when I was on mat leave, I updated my LinkedIn profile because I was so cross about this. I was like, I'm gaining so much knowledge about like empathy and creativity and project management and patience and all these things, you know, that the transformation you undergo when you become a parent is huge, but it's almost like when you're in a workplace, that side of you just has to be parked somewhere else. So I think you've got like a cultural aspect there of how just as a society, but within workplaces, we value caregiving as beneficial. The contributions that parents can give are huge. And then we have a kind of systemic thing where it's still more expected for men to work full time, where paternity leave is still really shoddy. It doesn't make economic sense for a lot of families for men to take extended paternity leave or do shared paternity leave. But I think there is, to be honest, I actually think we need a whole rethink of the way that work as a concept is structured, because it very much has, going back to that like rational man model, it's all based around that. And that's just not how families and people exist anymore. So there's a whole bigger sort of structural thing. But in terms of like what individual workplaces can do, which I guess is an easier question to answer, is really just like having a bit of emotional intelligence and a bit of empathy within teams. And even just on practical stuff, I was thinking about this, of people saying, friends of mine saying, you know, they're having Zoom coffee mornings and pub quizzes, and when we were in lockdown and they were looking after their children full time, I don't have time to go to a pub quiz. And it felt a lot like the old, you know, we're not going to have a staff room, but you guys can go meet up in the pub after work kind of mentality, which is so exclusionary for so many people. So it's just being mindful of that like people carrying responsibilities have different needs, but also they bring a lot to a workplace as well. So just practical bits and pieces like that, as well as thinking more broadly that actually the whole structure of work doesn't work for a lot of women and for caregiving. So revolution essentially is what I'm proposing.
That's exactly how I was going to summarize it in one word. But I think we need it. I think we kind of reached that almost like that threshold, that breaking point that after 6 months in lockdown, we are all really seeing that this is not a sustainable way of living, especially things that you mentioned, like, you know, those success stories of I'm so great at juggling that I only get up at 5 a.m. and then I go to bed at midnight and I still manage to do everything. And I totally can like empathize with that myself. Like my daughter woke me up at 5 a.m. the other day and I was so lucky. Like I was so happy that I managed to squeeze in like 2 hours hours of work before my normal kind of wake up time, because she was just playing, and I was like, woohoo, this is like, I'm so efficient today. And it's only like taking a step back and being like, this is not actually being efficient. This is like very unsustainable, but we are raised with that sort of system in mind, and those sort of expectations of like, you need to be able to juggle everything, other people manage that, and it's just a completely rotten system. So
and it's the workplace thing where it focuses on tasks rather than like, or it focuses more on like the time spent on doing stuff, and it's productivity, like boom, 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 boom. You must always be churning out all the time, rather than seeing rest as part of useful work as well, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, we can all get better at that, but especially as employers. And so I agree with revolution. Like, I think it's we are at that
the only option.
Exactly. It's just like, it's not built better, it's just built again from scratch, and design something that it's more sustainable and works for more people. I totally agree with that. So moving on to Raveena and Miriam. So you're part of our Young Women Leads program this year. And this year your research transitioned from education to employment for young women from ethnic minority backgrounds. Could you tell us more about this research and its results? And this is like the first time that anyone is speaking publicly about this research. So you guys are getting a great review. Yeah.
No pressure. We'll just try and cover it. We actually have some slides, so I will just try and share my screen.
Perfect.
Great. Can everyone see them?
Yeah, perfect. So Young Women Lead, just a little tiny bit of background. So it's a leadership programme run by YWCA Scotland and Scottish Parliament that aims to give young women between the ages of 16 to 30 in Scotland the opportunity to form a committee and lead an inquiry of a topic of our choice, which is what our cohort of 25 young ethnic minority women living across Scotland, including myself and Raveena, did. As you mentioned, for our chosen topic is the transition from education to employment for young Black, Asian and minority ethnic women. And it was the lack of Scotland-specific data on our chosen topic, which is why we wanted to investigate what measures are being taken to increase the employment opportunities for women from ethnic minorities. More specifically, we looked into measures that are being taken to increase employment opportunities for women, including recruitment, retention, and development of policies, and also best practices.
So in February, we actually, after a series of training sessions that we had with YWCA Scotland, our cohort was able to enter Parliament in February, and we had our first committee session where we invited a series of witnesses to give us evidence on the inquiry. So that was the basis of basically to inform our engagement process following this. So we met with Adopt an Intern, Sikhs and Jog, which is a third sector organisation, the Council of Ethnic Minority Voluntary Sector Organisations, Amina, and we also had Skills Development Scotland present there. And following this, we were able to kind of have a bit of a springboard to basically inform our engagement with employers, employees, and issues basically specific to young BAME women. We actually also met with one of Lindsey's colleagues at Close the Gap as well, so that was also really helpful.
Following our first committee session, we worked over COVID-19 pandemic and really at the start of lockdown. And the committee met virtually to plan and deliver our engagement work. We initially separated ourselves into two groups, focusing on the different aspects of the inquiry, so education and employment. Each group launched about 2 online surveys each. The education team focusing on lived experiences of the BAME women in education and looking at career teachers. And employment focused on employers and BAME employees, the lived experiences. On top of this, to supplement the evidence gathered in the surveys, we also carried out an online focus group, which Raveena will discuss shortly, and employer interviews to gain additional insight. Regarding specifically the employment side of the inquiry, we engaged with employers and young employees through survey analysis, and engagement with employers was quite difficult through COVID. It proved difficult, but we were able to carry out a piece of work and got a lot of insight from young women. And these are just a few examples of some of our findings. But 80.4% of survey respondents said that there are no BAME women in leadership positions in their workplace. And this, for role models, this was a really running theme for all our 4 surveys. It was predominantly a huge theme. And on top of that, 52% of survey respondents felt disadvantaged at work due to their race, ethnicity, culture, or religious background. 49.5% of survey respondents said that their organisation did not offer a diverse and inclusive working environment for specifically BAME women.
And I guess one thing that I would add from that is, like, we didn't take COVID into context during, we were already at the engagement process. So that's also another thing to take into account, is that the pandemic would have made a lot of these experiences, these lived experiences, these stories so much worse had our survey engagement began at a later stage. So just to follow up on what Miriam was saying, we, after initial analysis of the surveys, specifically our survey where we engaged with young BAME women, we thought it was important to carry out an additional focus group where we held a virtual focus group with about 10 women, where we wanted to go a little bit further into recommendations they thought that would help. We wanted to gain a little bit more insight into some of the lived experience that they shared. Through this, we were actually able to confirm, I mean, I have to say that our findings, there were a lot of findings, so we're just briefly going over this as well, but we were able to confirm that young BAME women, the ones that participated with us, did not feel that they can present their true self during the recruitment process, as well as also employees in the workplace, and that they feel that employers, and I guess like the labor market, have presumptions around their capability based on gender and ethnicity. And I think that's quite key to, when we're talking about the economy and women's issues, to remember that an intersectional lens really does need to be applied, because BAME women, particularly even more so young BAME women, have very different challenges when it comes to access, progression, increase in wages, and so forth.
We thought we'd just show some of our recommendations that we've made on the back of that. Top one there, employers should be encouraged to draft job specifications in a more inclusive way, encouraging BAME applicants explicitly where possible. The government should develop a guide to talking about race and ethnicity at work. We got a lot of recommendations at the back of that, definitely.
Yeah, so I guess I would say from this is that there were a lot of recommendations, and the final report is yet to be launched, and so on. And so there will be more information on this at a later stage. But in terms of the initial recommendations that we thought were quite vital, is that conversation around lack of role models. Employers need to do more to think about what role models young women, and particularly young BAME women, need in the workplace. They need to be more explicit about what career pathways are, or how progression works, more information about training and development. And I guess there's different stages. So the first part is access. So it's about how the recruitment practices. Then it's about development and making it more clear as to how people can continue to develop once they're in the workplace, and achieve those higher places of leadership where decision making takes place, and making sure that thinking about who has a seat at the table. And then the other side is that employers also have a responsibility, and the government has a responsibility to make sure that employers are held accountable in things like the race pay gap, and they're celebrating best practice and highlighting who's leading work on this in Scotland, because I have to be honest, we found it really difficult to find out which employers in Scotland. There's so much information on England, and of course similar issues, but there's just so much more conversation in England compared to Scotland, and that's a massive problem. And that's really one of the key things that we found out with this inquiry. Great. Well, I'm not sure if anyone has any questions, but I think there'll be an opportunity for questions at a later stage. Is there anything you would want to add, Miriam?
I think there's one little thing where that we found out with, especially in the employer survey data, that it indicates that employers are generally like satisfied with their current BEAM policies and plans, but the overall employee data suggests the complete opposite, that the sentiment is like not shared at all. And that was one of our biggest like differences that we saw, that, and I think there's a huge problem there, that either communication is not there, like, or don't feel comfortable enough to discuss employer workplace, or that we found a lot is that there's not enough BAME specific things going on in the workplace. And I think that is hugely, like that intersectional lens is really a big factor.
And that goes back, I guess, to what we were talking about before, to that surface level sort of approach of feeling like you tick the box and you have a policy, and kind of ignoring the lived experiences of people either in your company or trying to access those opportunities and not even being able to go through that first hurdle. Alys, I could see that you and
me. I just come in that. I think it's really, really interesting, and especially what you're saying about perceptions and I guess the sort of complacency of employers. And again, you see that echoed in things like housework. If you ask in an opposite sex couple, the man will generally think he's doing half the housework and the women not. And so the importance of data in all of this stuff, but also in, I think it goes back to what Lindsey was saying about the invisibility of lots of this work. And when we're talking about BAME employees, all of the emotional labour that goes in with educating colleagues about racism, about dealing with the microaggressions or the outright discrimination and racism that's faced. And again, we don't have a way of capturing that. So we don't capture that it's always the women that make the rounds of tea in the office or are asked to do the filing. We don't see who are the person that colleagues go to when they're upset because they've heard an inappropriate comment. And so I think that the sort of work you've been doing is really important to gather that data. So both about the numbers, and Scotland is shocking on collecting data, gender disaggregated data, race disaggregated data, things that help us understand the actual situation, but also the qualitative stuff you're talking about how do people feel. And that's just, heartbreaking statistics, of how many people feel that their organization is crap for them. Like, it's awful.
Yeah, and I think another thing that I would say is that this is something that our cohort felt at a later point in the engagement, is that it's really that point about disaggregate. I can't even say it. Disaggregated data. Always such a struggle. But with data, it's really important to look at specific identities. So, I often feel that me as an Indian woman, a British Indian woman, I don't have maybe the same challenges that another person of color. And that is something that is noted in data, is that British Indians, and I'm sure Scottish Indians too, although we don't have data on it, but British Indians have more advantage when it comes to, fare better when it comes to outcomes because of their relative privilege. And that needs to be accounted for as well. Like, who has, within BAME communities, who is more disadvantaged? And it's not like a catch for all, like all BAME communities, all non-white people. We need to do something for them in the labor market or in our workplace and put them all together. So what are their individual needs?
Absolutely. I think that was highlighted really well with the sort of grades, predicted grades in universities stuff, in that we know that, and again, there's better research on race in the US than there is here, and England than there is in Scotland, but yeah, so because of cultural racism and stereotyping, so Asian students were regularly being given higher predicted grades than actual grades, and Black students, African American and the American research students, were regularly being predicted lower grades, which, when we're talking about the pipeline to employment, is, and again, COVID has really highlighted that actually we're relying on these racist, sexist, white supremacist and patriarchal systems that have existed forever, which aren't just, they're not just abstract things. They have massive impacts on people's lives, and they are based on bigotry, at the end of the day.
Yeah, and that, again, like, I feel like it goes back to, like, exposing those cracks. Like, I think we are for some people, like they're really seeing them for the first time, like they're just so clear, they're in plain sight, you see them every day. And I'm a bit naive, but I'm hopeful that that means that we can really mobilize for change, that if everyone can see what's happening, if it's happening at your home, if it's happening at your school, and if you see it every day and you see it in the news, like I'm hopeful that that will enable us to build better future after this, but maybe it's me being slightly naive, but fingers crossed. So I'm mindful of time. I've realized that we only have about 10 minutes left, and I could see that the questions are coming in as well. So I think I will wrap things up with one final question to all panelists, and then we'll take those questions that were coming in as you guys were speaking. So the final question, it's a big one. And it's for all of you. What's one thing we could do in Scotland to create an employment environment that is fair to women in the workplace? So if you are going to choose just one, other than burn it all to ground and start from scratch.
That's just my go-to answer.
Yeah, smash the patriarchy.
I can't think.
Yeah.
But I agree with you on the hopefulness, though. I do agree on that. And I think that, like, so a piece of work that I'm involved in where we're looking at COVID, community responses to COVID, already when people talk about it, it's kindness and it's connecting with people. Yeah. That's really what held people together through lockdown, and now when everyone's starting to get a bit depleted again, and that's what's going to hold us together in our communities. And I do think that people are connecting with each other in a much more vulnerable, empathetic, honest way. So I think hopefulness is totally grounded in like a truth, like people are doing that. So I think revolution with kindness, kind revolution is a fierce compassion. That's what I've been reading, that fierce compassion. Yeah, but I think that's what we need, is like a big, massive change. And I think people are ready for it.
Yeah, I love the idea of kind revolution. That's great. Is there anyone else who wants to come in on one thing that we could do?
Yeah, I mean, I can come in. One of the things that we run into time and time again when it comes to making real change in the labour market is, well, equal pay is a requirement by law, so like you're totally covered by law, ladies. I mean, equal pay law, it's imposing an individualised response to a structural problem. So it relies on individual women, A, realising they're being paid unequally, B, having the resources, the mental resources, the actual, time resources, the money to take a claim, and then, the claim finding in their favour. And then that's great for that woman. But there's no provision for that one case to impact how equal pay law functions, more broadly. So there's no learning from it. There's no updating of the law or of any regulations or of what employers are meant to do. So the one thing that I would say would be that the law and policy has to recognise and respond to the fact that this is a structural problem. It has to happen. I mean, while like things are really important for individual women to be able to access support, it's not going to result in the change that we need to see. So we need to see laws in place that respond to the problem. We need those legal remedies to be accessible and not just present. We need government to develop meaningful policy that tackles the issues instead of just tackling the easy to do things and leaving the tough stuff for later. This is all one thing. And we need accountability for what's already in place. Like in Scotland, we've got the Scottish specific duties of the public sector equality duties, which is the bane of my life, because there's such poor compliance by public bodies with these duties, especially when it comes to the employment duties. Like there's such a lack of stuff happening that's really creating change, and there's very little recourse, for that. There's not any. It's difficult to see how that is going to change, to actually lead to something positive. In terms of practical things that could happen, examples of that, like the government could fund universal free childcare. That would make a huge difference to lots and lots of women's lives. And I think one of the questions I noticed in the question and answers on the programme for government plans to ensure 16 to 24-year-olds have access to training, employment and college, is this feminist enough? No, because we know that it will just fall straight along gendered lines, you know, so young women will be funneled into those training opportunities that are less beneficial to them, such as like in the modern apprenticeship programme. The apprenticeship frameworks that are dominated by young men are better paid within the apprenticeships and lead to better pay again once they graduate from those. And for young women, there's no pay bump while they're in the apprenticeship. They're paid the bare minimum, and then it doesn't lead to any improved pay for them when they complete it. So what is that delivering for women? Not much. And also, I think that those new plans, as they've started to transpire, don't just include jobs. It's not about guaranteeing that every young person will be in training or jobs. Work experience and volunteering opportunities are part of that. And unpaid work is not going to tackle inequality. So it's not feminist enough. I would personally burn it down and start again, but you know, if it could be designed, if the plan, you know, the implementation plan could be designed to do things to tackle occupational segregation as part of the work of that programme, then that would help. And that's all from me.
Thank you. Is there anything that Alys, Raveena or Miriam you want to add to that?
I guess I would just say, like, you know, when I saw this question, I was immediately drawn to like, oh, okay, what policy response could we have? But I think what Ellie was saying about kindness is just so key. I think emotional intelligence, empathy, that is really what's lacking. I don't want to say something as horrible as this, but if policymakers, I was going to say civil servants, but if policymakers were driven by empathy and emotional intelligence, if those in decision-making places across sectors and all workplaces had that at the heart of what any decisions that they were making, then the various experiences of employees would be taken into account, the various identities, and it would encourage people to bring their whole selves to work. So I do think maybe it really is just about empathy, kindness, and emotional intelligence.
Yeah, that's such a great point. So I think we are looking like at kind revolution of just totally redesigning the system that is no longer fit for purpose for many reasons. And that's kind of I think I noticed, Alys, that you said that I'm not naive but optimistic, and I think it's like with that optimistic vision for the future, like this is a really nice way of wrapping things up. Because there are so many structural issues, there are so many inequalities, and there are so many intersections of these, but I feel like we are at that kind of almost like the first step of revolution, of being like we are really in a position to start demanding change. And I am hopeful that, you know, in a year, 2 years or 5 years, we'll just see a system that is more fit for purpose, so we can actually bring our authentic selves to our workplaces. And I think that's such an important point, like the emotional labor of trying to pretend that those identities are completely separate, that as a worker you cannot bring anything of your authentic self to the table. It's just not sustainable, and it's not how we should be building our workplaces. This is not how we can achieve equality in any way. So I'm really, really hopeful. I've just realized that we ran out of time for questions as well. So I'll bring Elena back to wrap things up, if she can appear on the screen. But what we could maybe do is take a note of these questions and some of these discussion points and put them on our Twitter, and then if the panelists would be willing to maybe engage through that platform, or we can just open up that discussion to other people, because I couldn't even keep up with everything that was happening on chats, but I can see that there are loads of comments and suggestions and great links to resources. So we'll make sure that that we capture that and we'll post it on our Twitter so we can maybe continue this conversation. And I just wanted to take this opportunity to thank everyone who attended today, but first and foremost, thank all the amazing panelists who joined us today. I think it was a brilliant start to our series, and I'm really excited to see how things move forward in the future with so many amazing people driving for that change, many of whom are actually in this digital room with us today. So thank you so much for joining us today, and check #ScottWomenSkills, and if you have any additional questions, like post them there and we'll make sure that we share them on our Twitter. And if you follow that hashtag, you can also see in the future events that we have lined up for you. So thank you so much again for being here with us today. Elena, is there anything from the practical tech side of things that we should wrap up things with?
No, just to say that this event recording will be going on our YouTube channel. So if you want to go back and watch it again, take note, share it with your friends and family. I'm going to upload it now. So it will be up within half an hour, and we'll get the subtitles onto it corrected as soon as possible. Apart from that, have a wonderful evening.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.